A glimpse of what is possible. This is where Mark and Jeff and Heather talk about this. This is a picture of Mark from the spring of 2012. He and I and Jeff Edwards and actually Heather, we were all there. We went to, it was a self-advocacy conference that the federal government put together, and we were all part of the state team for Kentucky to build a self-advocacy plan for the state of Kentucky. And we were in our small group. And I was sitting next to Heather and Mark, and I was off task. Heather and Mark were on. I have no idea what Jeff Edwards was doing, but we can only assume that being the director of protection advocacy, he was on task. And I was kind of whispering to them back and forth, and I was asking, Heather and Mark, what does Mark do? And he worked at Walmart, and where does he live? He owns his own home. Oh, that's incredible. And he was, really so much different than the lives of the individuals I had seen, especially that cold December day in 1970. And I had really forgotten about those people. In Dante's, was it Dante's Inferno? This says, abandon hope, all ye enter. I really felt that at that place that I entered that day in December 1970, they could have had a sign that said, abandon hope, all ye enter. And so I had put that on my mind. I had thought about the lives of people who I'd seen really had improved. But I really didn't think that any of those people that I saw that day would have made it out alive, or certainly would have made it into a life that you or I would want to live. So we were talking, and I don't know how we got into this, but I think Heather said to me, Harold, Mark used to live in a state institution. And I said, what? And he works and he owns his own home. Yeah, he lived in a state institution. Yeah, he was in a state institution when he was 13. Well, that's interesting. So we were and so I said, all right, what state institution? Frankfurt State Hospital, the same hospital I had. So we did a little bit of math, and Jeff Edwards has since confirmed the dates. Mark was there that day that I visited. He was 13. He may or may not have been in that room. He was someplace in that setting. And I had no ability to work in that group. I was absolutely stunned. It was like my life had come full circle. It was like something that I didn't think possible had happened. And here was a person who had a very, really meaningful life that any of us would choose, who had been in that situation. You talk about the power of the human spirit. So, Mark's story is told by Heather and Mark and Jeff, how he came. I kind of lived the history. I worked in all kinds of teaching situations, from schools in which kids were absolutely excluded from public school to kids being included in general classes. But I served on one end. Mark lived that life, lived that history. So I want to take some time and have them kind of fill in the blanks. I think this, the power of the story of what I just went through is not all these laws and conditions and all of that, but it's the stories of lives that have dramatically shifted. So I did not know if I saw Mark that day, but I did see Mark in Chicago, and I've seen him several times since, and so I know what his life is like. So maybe just a little talking about what your life is like now, and maybe a little bit of history, that to the extent that we can fill it in, that got him to that. Because it's understanding that we can we can make that happen for other folks as well.
So do you want me to start, Mark?
Absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. You was up to me.
So Mark Group was born in rural Taylor County. He is one of 3 siblings. He is the middle child. When he was, what, 7? Was the first time? 7 was the first time that Mark went to Frankfurt State Hospital, wasn't it, Mark? Okay, you're going to have to speak.
Yes.
And
So-
let me say, this is not, because this is typically, the situation, you want someone telling their own story. This is a complete friendship between Mark and Heather that is what we've worked toward, I think, for a lot of us that have been in the field. So this is not somebody speaking for Mark. This is a friend that knows Mark's story. So I want that part to be clear for people.
Me and Mark have been together for 13 years. I've been his personal assistant.
Yes, she was.
Yes. We've been together for a long time, and Mark allowed me to dig up a lot of his information for Jeff throughout the years.
Yes.
Do you remember very much when you were 7? Because you were really little that first time. Do you remember very much?
Not really.
Not really. So then what happened after that first time? I think you went back home, right? And then your grandma said she couldn't take care of you and your brother.
Yes.
So you guys went back and you were 13. And so your brother would have been about 14 years old. You guys lived there for a couple of years that time. And that's when Harold, sorry.
Whatever.
Sorry, I'm nervous. It's when Harold, I was close though.
Yeah,
That's good.
you're very close.
That's when Harold interviewed when you were there. Do you remember more that time, right? Do you want to tell us about it? How were they to you guys?
Not too good at all.
They weren't too good at all. Were they mean?
Can't do anything. Can't go out nowhere.
You couldn't go nowhere? No. You want to talk about the cemetery? What did you used to see at the cemetery when they would take you outside?
We saw the huts come up in the cemetery. Well, and what happened was out of huts in the cemetery. The hut, they brought the casket out of the huts, put it in the grave.
You guys, what you told me a couple years ago, and we were actually at the cemetery, and this has probably been 4 or 5 years ago, and Mark had a memory, and it was, we were standing there, we had cleaned up in the cemetery for that year. And he was like, I used to stand there and watch them bury people. So from what I've gathered is they would take the kids out there, and that would be like the recess time, and watch people get buried.
And the Frankfurt State Hospital, at one point in time, was up over 1,000 people that were living, in several buildings. So you've got to remember that Mark, at the age of 7, would have been living in a place as a 7-year-old with people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, with staff that were underpaid and overworked, with little or no supports. I mean, the food that was consumed was grown there, cattle on the property. It was a huge industry unto itself. So that's where Mark, as a 7-year-old, would have been living alone. So you just need to get a picture of what that would have been at that point in time.
Like me and Jeff have talked a lot about memories, but we don't want to push Mark.
No.
Whatever's repressed needs to stay there. That has been something that we don't know how bad it was, and we don't want Mark to relive that. So
Well, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, do you want me to keep on going with
Yeah.
this history? So Mark was one of the first groups to be moved out of Frankfurt State Hospital, and he got sent to Oakwood, and he was in Oakwood for 10 years. And then from Oakwood, he went to Panorama in Bowling Green, which would have been his first actual community style placement. And then Karen Gardner from Camelsville went and got Mark and brought him back to Camelsville, to his hometown. So if it wasn't for Karen,
Do you know how that connection was made from Karen? How did Karen know Mark?
He was from Campbellsville.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought too, Carolyn. I believe it was probably one of those local ARC things that were providing some kind of support in what educational stuff is going on.
because Karen and Mark are close to the same age, so I don't know if it was just in the community. And Karen may be on and can actually answer us. I just know that Karen went and got him and brought him back to Taylor County. So I don't know if that was a childhood thing that she knew him, but I know at that point Karen became case manager, I believe.
Do you know what year it was? I think she was.
Early 80s.
I think she was with the local community mental health center, which was in Johnstown.
Yes, she was with the doctor.
Johnstown.
Yeah.
It's possible, I don't know. Where did Ms. Mark go? So Ms. Frankfurt State was gonna close.
Mm-hmm. And that's when he went to Oakwood. He was transferred to Oakwood.
Yeah.
So it's real possible that somehow there would have been something.
Well,
I'm trying
and
to figure out, Jeff, he wouldn't have had new neighbors money.
no, he would have had state general
He would have taken
funds.
funds. Anyway, just trying to, that would be a good part to get to ask Karen.
Okay.
There are many things that kind of to piece together, which I think would be very, very interesting. To be the dramatic is that he not only survived to get out of there.
Yeah, and he got out of there early.
Yeah.
In our history of community services, because there weren't many people
Yeah.
able to do that.
Yeah.
And if you read Mark's staff notes from Oakwood, Mark was very congenial, like Mark is now. Mark, now, you didn't like to do your chores at 17, which I thought that was ironic that they spent time documenting that, because that was a big deal, that Mark had to be told more than once to clean up after himself. But he still always did it. So, and then pretty much after he got there, by 76 and 77, Mark was already going out of Oakwood into the community and that kind of stuff. So a lot of it went, for me, was the fact that Mark was a nice person and he wasn't going to cause any trouble for people. So, you know, Mark being a nice guy, I think got him into that early stage of it, just like the people that we know that didn't get services until the 90s because of behavioral issues. It kept them isolated. But Mark was just a nice young man and did everything he asked and was helpful to people. So that carried him through life.
So Karen Gardner worked to help you to move back to
His family.
his family, okay, in
Campbellsville.
okay.
Mark's father also had an intellectual disability,
Mhm,
and the mother had run off when him and his siblings were very little.
mhm,
So the family, Mark's family, did not want to take care of the dad
Mhm.
and the siblings. And that's why the boys were sent
Mhm.
to the institution.
mhm.
But Karen worked with getting him back to Campbellsville. There was a time span, and I'm not really sure, but Mark did live with a family home provider for a while, and then he did live at home with his
Yeah.
dad. And he stayed at home with his dad until his dad passed away.
And also remember when you were sent to Frankfurt State Hospital, we did not have, that was around 1970, we didn't have a federal law saying that schools had to include children with significant disabilities. So it literally was on his family. You either just take care of this, of Mark and his brothers, or you had this, or a choice of an institutional setting. It's the kinds of services and things that we think of as being present now weren't there then. Okay, so you got back home. You stayed with your dad until he died. But at some point you got an opportunity to work, right? And
Yes.
to begin to live more independently.
Yes.
Now, I don't know this part of the history.
So as far as the stories that I've been told go back was Mark always wanted to live on his own.
Mhm.
And there were people that were advocating for him, like my current supervisor, Becky Wise,
Yeah.
were advocating for him to live on his own.
Yeah.
And he was able to rent an apartment.
Mhm.
And he lived in the apartment. Do you remember how long he lived in their apartment? I'm thinking it was probably 5 years or so.
5 years.
And then you wanted to rent a house. So then you rented a house, and you rented the house on Smith Ridge for about 10 years. And I came into the picture during this time span. I had just newly started in the field. The person that was working with him was quitting. I ended up starting with CLS. And Mark always wanted to own his own home. He had a job. He had a special needs trust. You know, he worked almost 40 hours a week at Walmart through supportive employment. And his house was starting to fall apart. And I was like, that's it. You've always wanted to own your own home. Let's go look at it. Because staff had tried in the past, but was always scared.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's, oh no, what happens
Yeah.
if this happens or that happens?
Yeah.
So he would start the process and then it would be stopped. And then I come in and said, let's do this. So me and his case manager at that time went and started looking at homes. And you found the home that you ended up buying, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
That was in Campbellsville?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And he has owned his home for 9 years. It'll be 9 years in November. 9 or 10.
But now you,
9 years. It's 2009 you signed the papers. And he worked at Walmart, and then you ended up quitting Walmart because they weren't giving you hours. You worked a few different other places, and then you got a job at Mericami, and he was working full-time there.
And where?
Mericami, it's a factory.
Okay.
It was part of the work initiative program
Mhm.
that Carolyn Wheeler had done in Taylor County, and had supportive employment specialists meet up with different factory,
Mhm.
you know, company heads or whatever for the
Yeah.
factories. But then Mark's decided with his health and stuff that he's kind of taking a retirement and going to be looking at a more laid back retired lifestyle. But he has lived a normal life with supports.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what you're wanting to get to. He
Yeah.
has done everything everybody else in the world can do.
He has worked, he owns his own home, he has friends, he participates in things. And are the things that you like to do either out in Campbellsville or at home or things, hobbies?
my hobby is work on the crafts.
But we've done lots of like activities,
Mm-hmm.
golfing, kayaking, concerts, you know, trips,
Camp out.
camping out, vacations to
Yeah.
Florida, vacations to North Carolina.
And to me, where I could give a presentation, and I can give it in much more detail about the history of the last 50 years in terms of key legislation and programs and all of these things. There's no more powerful testimony that I can think of than Mark's life of what has changed over those 50 years. Okay? And so here are some small signs of the progress. And this is things that kind of helps fill in some of the history in our own state that has led to some of the services and supports that are available. And Jeff is going to talk about these things.
Well, Frankfurt State's closing was a huge impetus, and I've got to move back a little bit from that because my slides, I copied the wrong one, so I can't remember what I put in order. Closing of Frankfurt State in the 1970s, like I said earlier, was the biggest, was a federal move. A state move on parts because the federal government was forcing them to do something about Frankfurt State Hospital and congregate living. This is what was going on around the country. The pictures that Harold showed from Christmas in Purgatory, you know, you can Google and watch the videos of what was going on in Willowbrook at the time in New York, which that story was the impetus for the protection and advocacy system that I work for today.
Yeah.
But Frankfurt State with up to 1,129 people, and when they built Oakwood, there was only beds for, it's only a 430 bed facility. So a number of those people that were living there went to personal care homes, were discharged basically to the community. Some people had community support, some didn't. There are still a few people in Frankfurt that you meet up with occasionally that lived at Frankfurt State Hospital. But a number of them did move to Somerset, which when the decision was made and the public hearings were held, that people in Somerset wanted to know how high the fences were going to be around Oakwood. And now it's, at one point in time, it was the second largest employer in Pulaski County, just behind the school district. So, and then the discussions that occurred when the Department of Justice came in because of abuse and neglect going on at Oakwood, and that forced it to be downsized. You know, one of the things the community cared about was, well, what's going to happen to these good paying jobs or these state jobs? That was the concern got to be. It wasn't, wow, this is our community and this is what we're doing to the people that live here. That was not the reaction, unfortunately. But even before that, there had been a Kentucky State Hospital in Danville that had people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and mental illness that also closed in the 1970s, and it has been absorbed for a North Point Training Center at this point in time. Because we went back and forth a great deal in Kentucky. You know, at one point in time, and we even had people were with intellectual developmental disabilities, those services had been attached to corrections. So there were a period of years where people living at Frankfurt State Hospital were referred to as inmates. So, but what Harold had said earlier was you got a lot of parents that got mad in the 50s because we had these kids that Frankfurt State Hospital, when it opened in 1860, the thought was you would go there for training for a little while, then you would go home. That never happened. You would have to go and actually sue to have your child or your loved one released back to you. So when we started using, and I think that's probably what happened with Mark, there was somebody, the Community Mental Health Center, Adonta, had decided to use state general dollars to support people in the community. And that was happening with estimates of upward of, at that point in time, of 8,000 people needing services. You had about 400 people statewide in the early 80s before the New Neighbors program that were getting services. I started working in the field in the mid 80s and had worked at Panorama a long time after Mark had been there. And Panorama is an institution that's now closed. It was in Bowling Green. And for Mark, going from a place of over 400 people at Oakwood to Panorama with 58 was quite an improvement, I'm assuming, Mark. It got to be a lot better. But so they were supporting people, but then with the AIS program came about, and that was the Alternative Intermediate Services, and that meant an alternative to institutional level of care is what was going on. And while those slots came out, and I was working at that point in time in the life skills region, that's Bowling Green, which is a pretty sizable region, you might get 3 slots in 2 years. So there was still what what I was raised up in the field referred to as that institutional bias, and very much a medical model that was going on. Because even when I started doing case management, it was licensing and regulation is who you ran your plans of care through. So there wasn't anybody in the disability piece that really understood disability. And there really wasn't anybody that was geared towards community-based services at that point in time. You had nurses that had worked at Frankfurt State Hospital, and they were looking at it as a plan of care. So we really had things documented about community involvement and those kind of things, but it never really was occurring the way it was supposed to. And I don't think it occurs most levels the way it's supposed to. And Mark is far from the norm of the life that he's had as a person dealing with services and supports through the Medicaid system. So, and another way that the parents really got active was when Outwood, that is in Western Kentucky, that's in Dawson Springs, there was a movement, and it had been an old tuberculosis hospital, like Hazelwood had been an old tuberculosis hospital. And there was a decision to tear down, to rebuild Outwood, and there was the plan to make it another 400-bed facilities. The Kentucky ARC was also involved, or there was ARC of Western Kentucky at that point in time, and they pushed to create slots in the community. Yes, sued. I'm sorry, not pushed, but they sued. So it became an 88-bed facility. But although it only became an 88-bed facility, that funds that would have gone theoretically to community services never.
That's how New Neighbor started.
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
That's how New Neighbor started. So state general fund always did fund folks.
Thank you.
Outwood to move into the community.
But we still had that bricks and mortar bias that we still have today, because if you are unfortunate enough to pay attention to what goes on in Frankfurt on a minute level, is, you know, when we spend $25,000, $30,000, $100,000 on buildings that were built in the 1860s because we are updating heat or we have to update technology, that's $100,000 that we are not spending on community services. It's not any more complicated than that. And that's still what we do in the state. We did that with Western State Hospital this past session. A huge amount of money to prop up bricks and mortar. So there was also with Hazelwood, during the Wilkinson administration, there was a move to close Hazelwood, and that caused
And to rebuild it.
to rebuild it, and caused a huge uproar for parents and those kind of things. So what they settled on was these 3 8-bed group homes that are licensed. I'm sorry.
And 5.6 million to Hazelwood.
Yes.
To do what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we did with that is we opened these 3 8-bed group homes that are technically ICFs.
Intermediate care facility.
Yeah, intermediate care facilities. It's the same level of care as Hazelwood is, and those are in Oldham and Jefferson County. But Harold and I, for years, were on the DD Council with Elder Bert Haley, and Bertie's son was at Hazelwood, and she decided to move him to one of the group homes. Well, it really wasn't a group home. It was an 8-bedder is what we called it. But there was that decision, and the blowback that she got from the parent group was unreal. The things they said to her, what a traitor she was to Hazelwood, and she was forcing neglect on these other people. It was really horrible the way they treated her. And I think that was some of that at that point in time, we were still dealing with fear of families, because if you had a child, you know, that was born in the 40s and the 50s and even the 60s with a disability, and you didn't have anything, you know, and I think that's what we have to remember. There wasn't anything for this person, unless you were going to send them to live with 1,129 other people in Frankfurt State. And no matter how old that child was, that's where they were going to be. So the thought of taking your, you know, eye off the ball and losing those services, or what's going to happen in the community, and are our children going to be safe, and people aren't going to show up to work, and people are going to take advantage of them. Some of the arguments that you actually hear today from some parents, and in some cases it's justifiable. And the vulnerability of adults and children with disabilities is something that you can't take lightly. And while I'm sure things that happen with 1,129 people were horrific, I think it's still in small settings it happens too. It goes back just to the vulnerability of people that we're talking about, and groups that are disempowered. And, you know, the amount of time that I've been in the field, and I did direct care and case management and ran a sheltered workshop for a little while, all before coming to protection and advocacy. But I remember meeting people that I had never laid eyes on and telling them that they had to get undressed and take a shower, or they had to go do this that would make them just vulnerable. And if they refused to do it, well, I documented that as them being non-compliant. And that is just ridiculous. And I say that out loud and I'm embarrassed every time I say it, because it just perpetuates that piece of it, and we don't think about that vulnerability of people. And we still don't think about that, empowering people with disabilities to say no and to protect themselves and to be believed, because we don't believe people with disabilities when they report. It's as simple as that. We will fall on the side of staff quicker than we will a person with a disability. And that's a sad reality. When I started protection advocacy in '96, one of the things that we were doing was called our 202B project. Because what we had done for years in the state is we had taken people that were committed under a 202B, and that a 202B in Kentucky sends you to Oakwood or Hazelwood or Central State. The Bingham unit is what it was known at that point in time. Well, these people were being sent to psychiatric hospitals sometimes, and there had been people that had lived at Frankfort State at one point in time and couldn't be cared for there, so people decided they were mentally ill, and or there was simply no place to go, and they might end up, they had ended up there for 40 years by the time we got involved in some cases, and it had been a horrible life that people had had. But there was not the thought of moving people until we got involved in that situation. And then that's when the supports for community living, about in that point in time, the AIS waiver became supports for community living. And there was a significant shift at that point in time in the way we were talking about services and people with intellectual developmental disabilities and how we were delivering services. And it was much more, for some of us, I will say, you were much more cognizant of how you were delivering services. We had a huge push in this state at that point in time. There were several of us that went through normalization principle from Wolfensberger and did social role valorization and passing.
Yes, Carolyn Wheeler worked for Wolfensberger.
Which is...
She did.
I also had working lab
Substitute,
Yes.
yeah.
as a graduate school.
So those are, provide valuable lessons in how we look at people. And some of those attitudes were changing, and we were starting to deliver those services in a different way. Michelle P. came about in 2008, and that was an answer. What started out when we were looking at it was aging caregivers. It was a suit by protection and advocacy. The cabinet will say it was an assault by protection and advocacy. It still occurs nationwide. You know, it happens when you have adult children with intellectual developmental disabilities and aging caregivers, and there's nowhere to go. That's a situation going on right now in Fayette County with a gentleman who's 85 years old and taking care of his grandsons after his wife of 63 years died. So, but fortunately for Michelle P., it did not have an age limit on it, so that opened that up to a lot of kids with autism and needs that they weren't getting met any other way. So there's about 10,500 kids, or adults and children, being served on Michelle P. About 5,000, is it about 5,000 on SCL at this, or is it 8?
It's about 4,100 on
Okay.
But about 5,000 on Michelle P. waiting list
So, yeah, thank you. That's what it is.
now.
So, but still with that 4,100 people you're looking at on the supports community living waiver, that's still, you know, you've got that many people who want the service. And we are a graying population. So since we can't figure out how to make parents live forever, they are going to need these services and supports. And we need to start talking about meaningful transitions for kids at the age of 14. We don't need to say, well, VR doesn't come in until they're 18 or until that last year of school. You have to push the districts to do those kind of things. Unfortunately, schools are not very, there's not a lot of imagination. I think I went to ARC meetings for years, but it was always the same ARC meeting with the same goals and objectives for a kid. It was just a different kid in a different district. There is no imagination that's going on, because it does become, I think, the path of least resistance. And that's when the parents, we have to get people to demand more. And that's some things that we still haven't gotten around to yet. There's another movement. We've had a self-advocacy organization in Kentucky in the past. There is movement to try to get another group to come back together, hopefully made up of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and mental illness, and a cross disability group at this point in time, to do some hardcore self-advocacy for themselves, because that's why we want Mark here and to tell his story as much as Mark wants to talk today. Because Ed Roberts, who was the father of the independent living movement, made it abundantly clear. When somebody else speaks for you, you lose your power. So that's why what has happened in Kentucky fascinates me, and I enjoy reading about it, but it's not my story. Like Harold was saying, our story's different. We're on that other side of it, watching it happen and not living that piece of it and making that difference. I think that Mark has for people, and the example and the dignity Mark has cannot be matched. But back to that day in Chicago, though, what was interesting was watching Harold realize that. Because for those of you that have spent any significant time with Harold and watch him, you know, complete a grant application at the same time he's booking an oil change for his daughter's car, and then he's communicating and trying to figure out how these people are doing or not doing what he wanted to do. He could not do that in that moment. And it was fascinating to watch. And it was like watching apps turn off. Because Harold, you had to say, I mean, you remember that part, stop, wait. He had to have the room quiet. And of course, it was a hotel conference room with this patterned carpet, and Harold just made circles traced with his foot on the floor. And your head had to power down. Yeah. And he had to concentrate on that one fact, because it didn't make sense that someone got out.
Yeah. From what I saw that day, it would not, you know, to me, I never thought about the people in that room except to tell the story,
right? But
never whatever happened to them, because I assumed that nothing would ever happen to them, except, as Mark said, to be brought out in the hearse and to be buried in the graves, which were unmarked graves. You know, and you know, so it just, yeah, it was like even though it's my professional life, but it was like the whole life had come full circle in a moment.